So one of the most common questions I get about potassium is how do you interpret your lab results when you go and get your potassium checked? You can check urine, you can check blood, you can even check your red blood cell potassium content. But what do these mean and how do you use these results to figure out whether you're getting enough from your diet or supplementation? So for this video, I decided to illustrate the results by going to the lab myself, getting poked and prodded yet again to show you what happens when I go on a low potassium diet for 2 weeks and then switch back to a high potassium diet for 2 weeks, checking all of these parameters at both stages of the experiment. Now, it's important to know that my usual diet is at least 5,000 milligrams of potassium from diet and supplementation. I get this from a couple of doses of 1,000 milligrams potassium supplement, plus a lot of fruits and vegetables and a good amount of meats. And this diet gets me to 4, 5, 6,000 milligrams of potassium on a regular basis. But I've done labs before and I've shown the results in other videos. So what I wanted to do for this one was not just replicate that, but to start by going on a low potassium diet. So I got rid of the vegetables, I got rid of the supplement, I limited the amount of meats that I got, and I kind of focused on more processed foods, rice, wheat, pasta, bread, the kinds of foods that don't have much potassium in them. After 2 weeks on that diet, I went back to Quest Diagnostics and I had them check my blood levels, my urine test, and I had them check my red blood cell potassium levels. Then once I got those results, I went back on a high potassium diet for another 2 weeks and I got the same results done again. So in this video, I'm going to compare the results on 2 weeks of a low potassium diet, then 2 weeks on a high potassium diet. And I'm going to use this to show you how your lab levels are going to reflect what your intake is. So let's get started. Now, before I show you my results, I want to just explain a little bit about what happens when, for example, you take a dose of potassium supplement or you have a meal that's got a lot of potassium. First, that potassium reaches your stomach and the small intestine where it gets absorbed across the wall of the small intestine and enters the bloodstream. Now, this creates a transient rise in your blood potassium levels. Almost immediately, millions of small pumps start kicking in on the surface of cells all throughout your body, sucking that potassium in from the extracellular space and the bloodstream into the cells. Now, most of the potassium in your body is intracellular. 98% or more of the potassium in your body is not in the blood. The levels in the blood are super low relative to what's inside your cells. So as soon as you increase the amount of potassium in your diet and it goes into the bloodstream, it immediately gets transported into your cells. And then what's left over reaches the kidney where it's filtered out in the urine. So we really need to think about when we take potassium or ingest potassium, that it's going into 3 different spaces. First is the blood, then is the cells, and then the overflow goes into the urine. And of course, those are the 3 compartments that we can check at a routine lab draw. Now, there's a couple of different ways of testing the urine, and in this video, I'm going to check the spot urine, which is just a single sample, and it gets analyzed for the amount of potassium in that sample. There's another longer 24-hour collection that you can do that's much more specific. However, I did not do that for the purposes of this video. There's also the plasma blood test, which checks the levels inside the bloodstream itself. And then there's a red blood cell potassium level that you can check where we're actually looking at how much potassium is inside the red blood cells. And the beauty of this is that it's relatively easy. You can do this in a couple of blood draws and a urine sample. So anybody can get this done at your local lab and get the results that I did. So, like I said before, my diet is usually pretty high in potassium. I take this very seriously. It's super important for your health. So my usual diet is pretty standard at the high end of what's considered normal for most Americans. Now, for this test, I really dropped my intake to about 1,500 to 2,000 milligrams daily, which is below the average for most Americans. The average in the US is about 2,600 milligrams of potassium daily, with the high end of that range, where experts recommend, is right around 4,700 to 5,000 milligrams of potassium daily from diet or supplementation. So after 2 weeks of a low potassium diet, I went in and I had these tests done. So let's start with a look at my plasma potassium levels, which is what's in the bloodstream. As you can see here, the level in my blood was 4.2, which is well within the normal range. The range for most lab tests of this type ranges from about 3.5 to 5.3 from the low to the high range. So at 4.2, I'm kind of right there in the middle. Now, I'm going to start by saying that anything lower than 4 is generally evidence of deficiency, but levels above 4 generally mean that your body's got enough to maintain levels in the right range. So for this at 4.2, we can see that my body is tightly controlling the blood levels, which is exactly where it needs to be because we want to have a low level in this tight range in the bloodstream in order to promote cellular function. Inside the cells, when we look at the red blood cell levels, you're going to see that the level is much higher, closer to 100. So you've got 25 times more potassium inside the cells than outside, and that's just normal. And your body's going to work really hard to keep it in that tight range. So even after 2 weeks on a low potassium diet, my body still hasn't really reached the point where the blood is depleted, and that's a good thing. Now let's look at the urine. So in the urine test, my levels were pretty low. As you can see, at the low end of the range at about 28. Now, the urine is really the overflow. So when you have low levels in the urine, what it means is your kidneys aren't getting enough. So they're not excreting potassium. They're trying to hold on to it to keep it in the body where you need it. So a low level in the urine is generally a good indicator that you're not getting enough. Now let's look at the levels inside my red blood cells. Now the intracellular level should be pretty high. The range on this test at Quest Diagnostics is between 90 and 110, which, as I said, is a lot higher than what we see in the blood. Now on my test on a low potassium diet, the level turned out to be 96, which is right in the normal range, but kind of towards the lower end. But it shows that my body hadn't been depleted. So after 2 weeks on a low potassium diet, my blood cells were in the low normal range. My blood plasma levels were in the normal range, and only my urine test showed that I was deficient, that my kidneys were holding on to potassium. So this is what it looks like on a 2-week low potassium diet. But let's take a look at what happened when I went on a high potassium diet, because the results actually surprised me and it made me really reconsider, like, what do these tests mean and how do you interpret them? Let's take a look. Okay, so again, let's start with the blood levels because this is what most people are going to get on your physical, on a routine screening. It's one of the most common tests we check. And in this case, on 2 weeks of a high potassium diet, my levels were 4.9. And I've done this test a couple of times before, and it's always in this range of kind of the mid fours. So on a high potassium diet, really pushing it with the diet and supplementation, I got my levels up to the high end of the normal range. Now, what this really shows you is that no matter what you do, if your kidneys are healthy, when you have a high potassium diet, your blood levels really shouldn't change too much. Now, it's very unusual to have levels that go above the high end of the normal range. And when we see that, most of us physicians look at that and we say they must have screwed something up in the lab test, because when you break up the cells and release that potassium, you can actually increase the level in the reading, but it's really not the blood that's high. It's because we fractured these cells in transport. So a lot of us, when we see a high normal or a higher potassium than the normal range, we'll ask first for a recheck. Now, of course, if your levels are high again on the recheck, your doctor is going to want to see you and figure out what's going on. But in most cases, if you have healthy kidneys, studies show that you can handle even up to 15 or 16,000 milligrams of potassium daily without measurably changing your plasma levels. And the reason for that is that we're going to push that potassium into the cells and then overflow it in the kidneys. So let's see what my level showed. Now, if we look to the urine test, we should see that on a high potassium diet, my levels should be going way up because my blood level stayed in a normal range, and all that extra potassium has to go somewhere, and it's got to go out through the kidneys. And in this case, that's exactly what happened. My repeat test showed a urinary potassium excretion of 82, which is triple what it was on the low potassium diet. Now, this is super important because the kidneys also regulate blood pressure. And when you're getting this high flow through the kidneys, you're resetting your renin levels, your sodium chloride cotransporter, and all of these other mechanisms that result in hypertension. So we're actually pushing all that potassium through the kidney and lowering the blood pressure along the way. But then we get to the red blood cells. And of course, what we expect to see is an increase in intracellular potassium content, because we know that all of these cells have got sodium potassium pumps, and they're going to really work to absorb all that extra potassium to enhance cellular function. So when we look at those red blood cell levels, we should see an increase. And this is the part that totally blew my mind. After 2 weeks of a higher potassium diet, my red blood cell levels actually dropped. They dropped to 89, which is below the normal range, earning me a red flag on my labs. And this one just really confused me, because I said, this doesn't make any sense. This should be way high so that those cells are rich and full in potassium. And it sent me back to the books to figure out two things. One is, why did this happen? And two was, maybe this is why red blood cell testing isn't common practice. And in fact, it turns out that there are problems with the red blood cell indices that make it not suitable for testing in clinical practice. And in this case, what I found was two things. One is that when you look at metabolically active cells, and we're talking muscle and nerve and brain and kidney, you see a huge amount of sodium potassium pumps on the surface of these cell membranes. A muscle cell or a kidney cell might have anywhere from 10 to 50 million potassium pumps along its surface. And that's to bring potassium in and create that gradient that powers the cell. And it turns out that red blood cells don't have that many pumps because they're not metabolically active. A red blood cell matures very quickly, and then it becomes kind of just a passive carrier for oxygen, bringing oxygen throughout your body. And this means that they require much fewer potassium pumps. In fact, the average number of pumps on a kidney cell might be upwards of 50 million. It might be only 100 to 200 on a red blood cell. So these are terrible cells for measuring intracellular content. About the best way you could do it is on a muscle biopsy, but I mean, who wants to get a muscle biopsy just to check their intracellular content? So the red blood cells are really a poor indicator. And I think in my case, they might have had a delayed reaction, that as I went from a high potassium diet to a low potassium diet, those red blood cells took time to absorb the potassium. And what I was seeing was the delayed effect. And this makes sense when you think about the life cycle of a red blood cell. They're very metabolically active when they're first created in the bone marrow, but then they mature very quickly and they become dormant later on from a metabolic standpoint. So what I might be seeing here is that the effect of the high potassium diet that I had for years before I did this test was reflected in those earlier readings when I was on that low potassium diet, because we were still checking cells that had matured when I was on a high potassium diet. And then weeks later, that level kept going down as those cells matured and they were created in an environment that was lower potassium. And in my experience and my results here show us that the blood levels and the urine levels are actually much more reflective of your total body stores. And here's why. When your body needs potassium, it's going to excrete less in the urine. So as you saw on my low potassium diet, the first thing that changed dramatically was the urine output. And we saw a 3-fold increase from a low potassium diet to a high potassium diet. And what that means is our body's getting enough and we're flushing out what's left. The other thing that you notice is that the plasma levels stayed in a very tight range. They went from 4.2 on a low potassium diet to 4.9, less than 1 point of movement on that dietary shift. Now, what happens is if your dietary intake is low, first thing that happens is your kidneys will hold on to potassium. But if you still continue to deplete your body will actually start to pull potassium out of the cells to maintain that tight range in the blood space. So what happens is that your body is going to keep it in that 4.0 to 5.0 range, the higher end of the normal range, as long as it can. And then when it starts to drop, what you're seeing is that you're not able to pull potassium from the diet or from the intracellular space, and the levels start to drop, drop, drop. And if they get below the normal range, below 3.5, you really have a problem. But anything in that 3.5 to 4 range means that you're probably starting to steal from the intracellular space. So I would suggest that if you see the urine levels low, it's probably an indication you need to increase the diet. And if you see the blood levels start to drop below 4, you really should be taking this seriously. And I would recommend not checking the red blood cell levels, although I will point out that if you're on a steady diet and it doesn't change much, these may be more reflective. I think when you're making rapid swings like I did from super high potassium diet to a low potassium diet and then back to high, I think the life cycle of a red blood cell just doesn't sync with those dietary changes. So I think it might be more reflective of longer term potassium intake on a steady dietary intake rather than being reflective of immediate changes in, what your lifestyle is supporting. So I hope this really helps you to interpret your own levels. If you've had yours checked and you want to share your thoughts, please do. And if you have any insight into this red blood cell phenomenon that's more detailed than what I've given you, please share that as well. I'd love to hear more. I always love to learn. So I hope this video has helped you to understand your own levels and to take notice next time you're at the doctor to how those levels reflect your dietary intake and possibly the need to increase your intake and achieve better health outcomes. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.